This story's pretty detailed, so I'm gonna get right into it. Only relevant details though. I'm 22 years old, freshly graduated from college since I was maybe 3 or 4. My family's lived in a 3-story home in a relatively nice area. If you're picturing the quintessential suburban neighborhood, you've got the right idea. As for the layout of the house, this is all you need to know. My bedroom, which is on the 2nd floor, has a window that faces the street. And the only window in my dad's home office, which is on the 3rd floor, also faces the street. That's it. The reason I'm writing this is because after the events of last week, I'm now 100% convinced something sinister is happening to my family. For some inexplicable reason, I can't even begin to conceive of. And if I'm connecting the dots correctly, which I'm pretty sure I am, it's been going on for years. This first relevant thing happened so long ago that I don't even remember how old I was. But I was young enough to still be in middle school, so it had to have been at least 10 years ago. It was either a Saturday or a Sunday since I didn't have school. And as I was walking downstairs for breakfast, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. I didn't catch much of the conversation, but I was able to hear my dad talking about how something had happened again, and it must have been at least a little concerning, judging by the tone he was using. My parents didn't tell me what was going on when I asked them about it. They actually didn't tell me directly for over a year afterwards, but I learned the real story a few days later from my older brother. My dad's a lawyer and often works into the night whenever he is pressured to finish something that doesn't get done at the office. And that's what he was doing until about 2 a.m. The night before, I overheard him talking to my mom about the incident. According to my dad, he was working away at his desk at around midnight when he noticed a Chevy Suburban drive down the street at like 5 miles per hour. That's not an exaggeration. He claims to this day that the car looked like it was crawling down the street, as if someone had taken their foot off both the guests and the brake, and was just letting the car idle forward. My dad didn't think much of it until he saw the exact same car drive back down the street, only this time in the opposite direction. And then even more strange, the car actually parked across the street, right in front of our house. My dad didn't take his eye off the car for a good few minutes straight, waiting to see whether someone would get out of the car or if it would drive off, but neither happened. The car just sat there. My dad didn't have the time or the patience to devote the rest of the night to watching the car, so he went back to work, glancing out the window every so often, out of curiosity, but nothing happened for hours. He swore no one ever got out of the car, since he would have noticed movement out the window if they had. Eventually he fell asleep at his desk around 2 a.m. without even completing his work. But here's the crazy part. When he woke up around 5:30, the car was still there, in the exact same spot. What happened while he was asleep remains a mystery, but my dad said he was so shocked to see the car still there. When he woke up, he thought he was dreaming. The car ended up leaving before sunrise, and even after finishing his work, my dad was so unsettled he couldn't sleep. I would eventually learn that this wasn't the first instance of something similar happening, that my dad had seen cars drive back and forth in our street late at night before, but it was definitely the strangest. No one in the family really thought anything of it for several years though. It was most likely just someone sleeping in a very coincidental spot. And at the very worst, it was someone driving around random, nice neighborhoods and casing houses. Fast forward a few years. I'm 15 now, a sophomore in high school. I remember the second occurrence much more distinctly, partly because it was more recent, and partly because it actually happened to me. I was up late making beats in my room, something I did quite often during that time in my life. Like I said earlier, my room has a window that faces the street, which I can always see out of, since my desk is right in front of it. I was vibing out with my headphones in when something from outside my bedroom window caught my eye. It was a little flicker of light. Definitely unnatural, and definitely not my imagination. I diverted my attention to the window and saw the strangest, most unsettling thing. There was a squadron of cars, at least 3 of them. They were driving down the street at a slow speed. That by itself doesn't sound so bad, but I quickly realized that the people in the cars were shining flashlights at houses. That's where the flicker of light had been. I kept watching in the state of confused angst as whoever was in the first car swept their flashlight beam across the house next to mine. Then they started shining their light at my house, and I actually ducked down underneath my windowsill when I realized the beam was about to sweep right past my window. Not 2 seconds after ducking down, I watched the flashlight beam illuminate my ceiling for a couple seconds before everything went dark again. I waited a good 20 seconds before re-emerging, and by the time I did, the cars were much further down the street. I watched as they got to the end of the street and turned off. You can probably imagine how I was feeling in that moment. It was tough to get much sleep after that. I obviously told my parents about it the next morning, and as a family, we collectively agreed that it was a group of thugs, casing houses, probably looking for ones with no one home that would make easy targets for a home intrusion. My dad installed a Ring camera after that, and he even put some security cameras with motion lights in our backyard. I can't remember for sure, but I think my parents might have talked to a few of our neighbors to see if anyone had experienced something similar. A couple years later, the next thing happened while doing some landscaping in our backyard. One of the contractors my dad had hired claimed to have found a small hidden camera tucked into one of the bushes near the fence. It was tiny. No bigger than a car key, but it was definitely a camera. It was battery powered, and the battery had long since died. It didn't have a SIM card or any memory card inside, which meant it wasn't storing anything locally or using cellular data. But that didn't rule out the possibility that it had been streaming footage to an external device nearby while it was active. My dad said the most likely explanation was that someone had been parked close enough to receive a live feed until the battery gave out. Why anyone would go through the trouble of hiding something like that on our property and then just leave it behind was a complete mystery to us. But it definitely wasn't the kind of thing that you stumble across by accident. As furious as my dad was, he couldn't figure out when or who had placed it there. Even after combing through the last few months of security camera footage, or at least everything the thing had recorded and stored, I was convinced that one of my friends had been pranking us. But even after pestering all of them, no one fessed up to placing that camera. My parents were really worried. We were being targeted, and they even reported everything to the police. But the home security they had already installed was pretty top-notch, so it wasn't like they could upgrade things much. Nothing happened for a little while after that. It wasn't like there was this cloud hanging over our heads. We all just kind of moved on with our lives the way most people probably would. The next thing worth mentioning happened a few years after we discovered the camera. Our immediate next-door neighbors moved away, and their house was re-inhabited super quickly, like it was only vacant for a few weeks at most. That's not exactly the most unusual thing. My neighborhood has always been a very desirable place for families to live. However, I noticed pretty quickly that the people who moved in weren't parents, just a youngish couple with no children. I remember finding that odd considering the size of the house. But I assumed maybe they were planning on starting a family, or maybe they just wanted a big place all to themselves. On several occasions after they moved in, though, I caught them looking into our yard through their top-floor window. Always at strange hours, either really early in the morning or really late at night. At first, I figured they had a workstation or office up there like my dad, and they were just seated right in front of the window. But then I noticed they were always standing, which eliminated the desk hypothesis. I knew I was just being paranoid, but I'm a pretty observant person by nature. So if someone's gonna do something out of the ordinary, I'm gonna notice it either way. I didn't think much of it, just found it mildly amusing that our neighbors seemed fascinated with the layout of our yard, or whatever else it was that they were always looking at. One night, while walking my dog on the street, I couldn't help but notice my neighbors in their kitchen through their big bay window. They were sitting at a table, and for the first time since they had moved in, there was a third person with them. The guy had really distinctive features. He was fully bald, really muscular, and had the thickest eyebrows I'd ever seen. The three of them. He and the couple were just sitting and talking at the table. Nothing unusual, but as if they noticed me looking. The woman swiftly walked over to the window and pulled the curtains over it. She didn't actually look out the window at me. None of them did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she shut the curtains because somehow she knew I was watching. Either way, I didn't forget about the man that had been with them. His face was just so distinctive. I don't really know what else to say. Okay, so now that you've made it this far, you're probably thinking that I'm some paranoid schizophrenic. I mean, that's what I'd be thinking too. But I would never in a million years be sending the story in if what happened next didn't happen. Like I said in the beginning, this happened last week, so about another few years after the last thing I talked about. A few weeks ago, my family took a trip to Paris. My older brother had been dating his girlfriend for years, and everyone was pretty much expecting him to propose while we were there, because we were going with her family too. A few days into the trip, we were at this random bar. Everyone was there. Me, my parents, my brothers, his girlfriend and her parents. We were sitting in a booth, enjoying a few drinks, and having some good conversation. I was maybe halfway through my drink, zoning out of the conversation, when I happened to glance across the room. There was this guy sitting alone in a booth, just casually sipping his drink and looking around the room. Something about him seemed familiar, but I couldn't immediately place where I'd seen him before. But then like a light switch had been turned on. I realized it was that man who I had seen at my neighbor's kitchen table years ago. There was no way I didn't want to believe it. What were the chances? This random guy from my neighborhood would be in the exact same bar as my family, and of foreign country, no less. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but the more I stared, the more certain I became that it was him. Then he caught me looking at him. He locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. He knew I knew, and he knew I could feel it. Then, without finishing his drink or paying his bill, he got up and walked out of sight. I immediately excused myself from the table and tried to follow him, but I couldn't figure out where he had gone. I ended up just sitting back down at the table, trying to suppress the nasty feeling I had, telling myself that the guy just happened to be on vacation the same time we were. Was the only way I could continue my night with my sanity. A few days later, we were doing some typical touristy stuff. It was broad daylight, and we were just walking around the city. When I saw him again, that same guy, I can't understate how shocking it was. If the first instance had just been a coincidence, this completely shattered that theory. He was standing maybe 50 feet from us, snapping pictures with a professional-looking camera. I couldn't tell for sure, but it kind of seemed like the camera was pointed in our direction, even though there was a famous monument behind us. I watched as he then turned a corner and disappeared out of sight. I finally told my parents about what was going on. I gave them every little detail, and assured them I wasn't going crazy. My parents actually believed me, my dad especially, and he even suggested cutting the trip short. We didn't end up doing that, but the rest of the vacation was awful. When we finally got home, my dad checked as much security footage as was stored, but didn't find anything. I really don't know what to make of all of this. I don't know what these people want from us or who they even are. But now I'm convinced they've been watching us for over a decade, which sounds insane, and I only have reason to believe things are gonna escalate from here. I live near Angeles National Forest. I've been hiking those trails for years, and I know them well enough that I don't really worry about getting lost or anything like that. I'm comfortable out there. The night this all went down, I'd gotten some bad news over the phone earlier in the day. It was the kind of news that makes you feel like you need to get out of the house and clear your head. Some people drink when they're upset. Some people call a friend. I go for a hike. It was around 8 when I set out. I wasn't planning anything ambitious, just wanted to clear my head. Maybe tire myself out enough so that I could actually sleep when I got back night. Hikes aren't unusual for me, especially on trails. I know. Well, there's something about being out there in the dark that usually feels meditative. The fog that night was something else though. I had checked the weather before leaving, but conditions at elevation are always a gamble. By the time I was a little ways in visibility, had dropped to maybe 20 feet. Everything beyond that was just gray. I tried using my flashlight at first, but the beam just bounced back at me off the moisture in the air. It actually made things worse, like trying to drive with your high beams on in a snowstorm, so I mostly kept it off, letting my eyes adjust to what little ambient light filtered through. I had music playing to deter any animals from bothering me, which was something I picked up from my dad. About an hour in, I noticed a smell. It was faint at first, and I actually stopped walking for a second because it caught me so off guard. It didn't smell like natural wood smell. It kind of smelled like perfume, which I know sounds absurd, but that's genuinely what it smelled like. It wasn't strong or overwhelming, just this distinct floral scent that had no business being out there. I looked around, which was pointless because I couldn't see anything anyway, and by the time I'd finished scanning the fog, the smell was gone. I didn't really know what to make of it, so I just brushed it off. About 10 minutes later though, there was a new smell. This time it was something a little more familiar: campfire, so I instantly connected the dots. There was someone camping somewhere out there, and that also probably explained the perfume smell. But the smell was only there for about 30 seconds before vanishing, which was a little strange. It wasn't until smelling the third smell that I thought something was really off. It was this herbal, almost earthy scent that I immediately recognized from my childhood, but couldn't place the familiarity of it, combined with how completely out of context it was, unsettled me. I probably should have turned around the moment things felt off, but I kept hiking. Things were normal for a while, and I started feeling better about everything, but as soon as I felt even the slightest sense of calm, I noticed a flashlight beam on the ridge to my left. The ridge runs parallel to the main trail, but sits maybe 100 feet higher, and there are no marked trails or access points up there, which I know for a fact because I've looked at maps plenty of times, wondering if there was a way to get up. The terrain is too dangerous. You'd also have to bushwhack through some seriously nasty stuff to reach that elevation from where I was, and yet there was clearly someone up there. The beam would turn on, sweep across the section of the ridge, then turn off, and then a few seconds later it would turn on against somewhere else. In that very moment, I realized listening to music was now a huge liability, so I turned the music off and listened. Whoever was up there was whistling, which sounds normal enough, but it really freaked me out. If I could hear them whistling, they would have definitely heard the music I was just playing at that point. I was several miles into the trail. The smart thing would still have been to turn around, but I didn't want to. There was a little overlook spot up ahead that I knew about, so I told myself I'd take a break there and think things through. But as soon as I made it there, I saw something that made everything about 100 times worse. There was a stone sculpture sitting on a flat rock near the edge of the overlook. I knew what that meant. I instantly stood up, turned around, and started walking back the way I had come. But out of nowhere, I heard rapid footsteps approaching me in the direction I was walking. It was unmistakable, 100% a person's footsteps, not an animal's. I didn't even have time to think. The footsteps were so close that all I could do was hold my ground and prepare for an altercation. I didn't even have time to run, but as soon as the footsteps were right on me, they just abruptly stopped. It was really scary. I kept staring into the fog, but I couldn't see anything. Part of me thought whoever had just charged me was now standing still somewhere out of my field of view, but that didn't make any sense if I couldn't see them. How in the world did they know where I was? I waited another few seconds and then pulled out the switchblade. I always kept for protection. I kept holding my ground, just waiting to see or even hear something waiting to be attacked. But now it was just dead silence. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to announce my presence, but I was pretty sure whoever was out there already knew I was there. The thing that made it so much worse was that the footsteps had come from the direction I needed to go to get back. There was no alternate route. If I wanted to leave, I had to walk directly toward where those footsteps had come from. I tried to hold out, but I couldn't wait there forever, so I started moving. I was fully expecting to see someone eventually, at which point, I don't even know what. This happened close to 20 years ago. Back when I was 15, my parents were in the midst of a really ugly divorce at the time, and my mom thought it would be a good idea for me to spend a few weeks with my great-aunt Lucy in upstate Vermont while they sorted out the legal stuff. I wasn't thrilled about being shipped off to some relative I barely knew, but I didn't have much choice. Aunt Lucy lived in this massive Victorian house that had been converted into apartments sometime in the 60s. She owned the whole building and rented out the top 2 floors to tenants while she lived alone in the sprawling first-floor unit. The place was beautiful in a very specific, old-fashioned way. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, intricate moldings around every doorframe, movie-type stuff like that. Which struck me as odd right away was that Aunt Lucy seemed to avoid certain parts of her own apartment. She had this huge master bedroom with tall windows and beautiful antique furniture, but she slept in a small den off the living room instead. That was actually one of the things I asked her about, to which she just replied that the main bedroom got too much morning light. I then stupidly asked if I could sleep in there then, to which she just glared at me disapprovingly. You gotta remember that things were a little different back then, and respecting your elders was practically law. So after that interaction, I held my tongue, not wanting to upset her further. The first few nights I was there, I kept hearing what sounded like someone walking around in the apartment above us. I figured it was just one of the tenants, maybe someone who worked late shifts. But the weird thing was how methodical the walking sounded, back and forth, like someone pacing the length of the apartment. After about a week of this, I couldn't keep things to myself and mentioned it to Aunt Lucy over breakfast. She again gave me the strange expression and said the second floor had been vacant for over a month. I insisted that I'd been hearing someone walking around up there every night, but she just shook her head and told me I was just hearing the buildings settling. Her explanation didn't make sense, but I wasn't about to argue. The next morning, I told Aunt Lucy I wanted to see the vacant apartment. She seemed reluctant, but I kept pressing, and eventually she agreed, just like she said. The second floor was completely empty, but as we walked through the rooms together, I saw something that immediately validated what I'd been hearing. There were fresh scuff marks on the hardwood floors, like someone had been walking the same path over and over. The marks formed a clear pattern from the front of the apartment to the back, exactly matching the route the footsteps seemed to make each night. When I pointed this out, Aunt Lucy said the marks were probably from the previous tenants, but they looked too recent for that. I told her this, but she just dismissed me like I was some babbling child that evening. She suggested we watch a movie together, which we'd never done before. As it got later, the footsteps from upstairs started up again. I looked at Aunt Lucy, expecting her to finally acknowledge what we were hearing, but instead she just turned the volume up and pretended like nothing was happening. I was stunned. My first thought was Aunt Lucy knew exactly what was going on and just didn't want to tell me. The next day I called my mom and mentioned the situation, and you know what's crazy? Even my mom seemed to know what was going on. She told me not to bring up the footsteps with Aunt Lucy anymore, and that it was, quote, a sensitive topic. One night near the end of my visit, I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. As I was walking back to my room, I glanced toward the staircase that led up to the second floor. The door at the bottom was slightly ajar, and I could have sworn I saw a faint light moving around up there like someone was walking with a flashlight. I immediately went to bed and did mention it to Aunt Lucy. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. If it hadn't been for that night, the two of us watched a movie. I would have assumed Aunt Lucy was causing the footsteps, but that was impossible. My mom refused to explain things to me when I got back home, and this actually caused quite the rift between the two of us. Years later, I found out through a cousin that Aunt Lucy had sold the building and moved to Florida. According to my cousin, there had been some kind of incident in the apartment back in the 90s. Someone had died there under unclear circumstances, and the family had tried to keep it quiet. That was also around the time Aunt Lucy had inherited the building. I've never believed in ghosts. I don't say that to sound dismissive or close-minded. I just genuinely don't. I think that's a pretty dumb way to interpret things you don't understand, to be frank. So when I think back on what I experienced in that house, I always find myself searching for some other explanation. Maybe Aunt Lucy was sheltering someone up there, a relative in trouble, or someone who needed to stay hidden. Or maybe she was being blackmailed, forced to let someone live in her building without anyone knowing. Maybe the incident my cousin mentioned wasn't as closed as the family wanted to believe, and whoever was responsible still had some kind of hold over her. Or maybe the entire thing was completely made up and my cousin was needlessly gossiping. I really don't know. What I do know is that my mom knows something, and I'll never forgive her for withholding that information from me. I think this is just one of those things that will never have an explanation. My name is Thomas. I've been working the late shift at our local Burger King for about 2 years now. It's not glamorous, but it pays rent, and the hours work for me. I'm a night owl anyway, so being behind the drive-thru window from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. doesn't bother me the way it would most people. This all started maybe a month ago. I was working the drive-thru solo, where we're usually understaffed after midnight, and that's when a car pulled up to the speaker. A male voice, pretty unremarkable, ordered a large double Whopper with cheese, meal, and a Coke. It was pretty standard. The one notable thing about the encounter was when he went to pay, he only rolled the window down just enough to slide his card through, and his windows were tinted, so I couldn't see his face. He paid, and I handed him his receipt, but then he just drove off without stopping at the second window to grab his food. I waited there with his bag for a few minutes, wondering if he'd be coming back. Eventually, I just set the order aside and ended up eating it later. People do weird stuff sometimes, so I didn't think about it too much. About a week later, it happened again. It was the same order and the same exact thing happened. Someone paid at the first window and then drove off before picking up the food. I remember thinking, that's strange. Someone did the exact same thing last week, but I wasn't quite able to connect the dots at that point. I just figured it was a coincidence. It wasn't until it happened a third time that I realized it was the same person making these orders. At that point, I knew something weird was going on, but I wasn't gonna complain. The food was made, paid for, and I was the one who got to enjoy it. So I kept eating the free Whopper meals and tried not to think too hard about why some random dude was essentially buying me dinner every few days. This went on for a few more weeks. The guy would show up every 4 or 5 days, always late, usually between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., and always with the same order. I started to almost look forward to it in a weird way, like, oh, it's been a few days. Wonder if my mysterious benefactor is gonna show up tonight. One night, I was working the speaker at around 2 a.m. when I heard that familiar voice through the speaker. I knew what was about to happen, and I was right. He ordered the same meal, which I knew I'd be eating. But this time, he said something else, something that made me freeze up. He said, and I'll never forget this, "I hope you've been enjoying those Whoppers, Mr. Hurley." My last name is Hurley. I don't wear a name tag with my last name on it. It's not posted anywhere customers can see. There's no reason at all, that this guy should know my last name. I just stood there for a second, not saying anything. My brain couldn't catch up. Then I started talking into the speaker, asking who this was, what he wanted, and how he knew my name. I must have said, "Who is this?" 4 or 5 times, but he never answered, and this time, he didn't even pull up to pay. I heard his engine rev, and then he was gone. I was rattled for the rest of my shift. There was nothing I could do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Little did I know, things were about to get much worse. When I got home after my shift, I found a note on my doorstep. It was a handwritten note that said, "I know what you did. You have 3 days." I just stood there, staring at it with my hands shaking, and I started feeling really sick, like someone had punched me in the gut. I have no idea what I supposedly did. I've been racking my brain trying to think of anything that could explain this, but I've got nothing. This sounds so stupid, but I don't have enemies or secrets. I'm a 24-year-old guy that works at Burger King and plays video games on his days off. I'm not exactly living the most exciting life. I didn't eat that night. Instead, I just sat on my couch with the lights on, dreading whatever was gonna happen next, but nothing happened. I had no choice but to just move on. It turned out I wouldn't have to wait that long, because the next night at work, that guy was back. This time, he didn't even bother playing games. Instead of ordering food, he just asked me to write something down. Then, before I could even respond, he gave me an address. It was some random place on the outskirts of town, in an area I didn't recognize. And then he told me I had 2 days to deliver him $10,000. I damn near laughed at that. I didn't think he was serious, but he clearly wasn't kidding. As soon as he drove off, I immediately went back to being terrified. There was absolutely no way I'd be giving that guy $10,000. I didn't even have $10,000. I still don't. So, I decided to ignore it. I figured it had to be some elaborate scam or prank from someone. I knew I should have called the police right then, but I didn't even think of that. 3 nights later, I thought things were over. I hadn't dropped any money off, and nothing had happened. But of course, I was wrong. I was sitting there, watching TV, winding down for my shift, when out of nowhere, I was jolted up by the sound of shattering glass. I hit the floor on instinct, thinking someone was shooting at me, but when I finally got up and looked around, I realized someone had just thrown a rock through my window. By the time I went to look outside, whoever had been there was long gone. This time, I called the police. I told them everything, including the address I had been given, and they said they'd check it out and told me to stay vigilant. They really didn't do much. They just told me they'd patrol the area a little more closely, and that without any doorstep footage, which I obviously don't have, there was nothing they could do. That was 3 days ago. I've called in sick to work the last 3 nights. But I don't even think that's gonna do anything since the guy clearly knows where I live. I can't afford to not work, and I can't afford to move. So I'm stuck in this nightmare until the police can track that person down. I think I might try getting them to track the credit card number that the guy used to pay for the Whopper meals. But other than that, I'm not really sure what to do. Why I got targeted, I have no idea. Hopefully, things don't escalate from here. I graduated from college about 8 months ago with a degree in communications, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, has been incredibly useful in helping me secure gainful employment. That's sarcasm, by the way. I'm still living with my parents and haven't been able to find a real job yet, so I'm off to a great start. In the meantime, I drive for Uber and Uber Eats, sometimes both in the same night, depending on what's popping. It's not a career, but it's money. It lets me feel like I'm doing something productive while I figure my life out. I know that sounds kind of pathetic, but it's what I've got right now. I drive mostly on weekend nights, Friday and Saturday, usually from around 9 p.m. until 2 or 3 in the morning. That's when the surge pricing kicks in, and the drunk college kids need rides home from the bars downtown. It's not technically a night shift, but it feels like one. This happened a few weeks ago. It was a Saturday night, maybe around 1:30, and I was about ready to call it. I was about to turn off the app when one more request came through. The pickup was downtown, which was fine, but the drop-off location was really far away, past the suburbs even. I almost declined it for that reason, but the fare was too good. The girl I picked up was completely normal. The drive took about 40 minutes. By the time I dropped her off, it was past 2 o'clock, and then I was alone, out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, with a 40-minute drive back to civilization. I turned the car around and started heading home. Not 10 minutes into the drive, I saw a car stopped in the middle of the road with its hazards on. I approached cautiously and realized there were 2 people standing in front of the car, waving their arms like they were trying to flag me down. My first instinct was actually not to stop, but I'm someone who can't just ignore a person in need. So, against my better judgment, I decided to stop. I stopped the car about 20 feet away from them and rolled my window down a few inches. Just enough to hear them, but not enough for someone to reach inside. It was a middle-aged couple, which actually put me at ease a little. That is, until they started talking. The woman did most of the talking. She had this frantic energy about her, but also something that felt slightly rehearsed, like she'd given the speech before. She said they were warning drivers about a collapsed bridge ahead. She went on to say it happened earlier that day, and they'd almost driven right off themselves. She pointed down the road into the darkness and said if I kept going that way, I'd end up in the river. So naturally, I asked them what I should do instead. The husband spoke of a turnoff that was about halfway between where we were and the bridge. He said it cut through the woods and that it would add some time to my drive, but it would get me back to the main highway without having to deal with the bridge. I thanked them and started driving. Something felt off. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. I was gonna trust my gut and just drive the way I had been intending to go. About a mile down the road, I saw the turnoff they'd been talking about. It was this narrow dirt path that disappeared into the trees, and it was barely wide enough for one car. I decided to keep driving, and a few minutes later, I reached the bridge. I slowed down a little, but it was fine. It wasn't collapsed for sure, and it didn't even look damaged at all. I drove across it without any issues and made it back to the main highway a few minutes later. Even though nothing happened, the experience stuck with me to the point where I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I'd followed that couple's instructions, if I turned down that dirt road, alone in the middle of the night. A few days later, the curiosity got the better of me, and I did something stupid. I drove back out there. It was the middle of the afternoon this time, broad daylight, which made me feel slightly less insane about the whole thing. I retraced my route from that night. Those people weren't there this time, obviously. When I got to the turnoff, that dirt path into the woods, I slowed down and pulled over. To my surprise, there was something new. There was a sign nailed to a tree right at the entrance of the path that simply said dead end. That sign hadn't been there before. I would have definitely noticed it that night, even in the dark. Someone had put it up in the last few days. I sat in my car for a minute, staring at the path in the daylight. It didn't look quite as ominous. It was just a narrow dirt road that disappeared into some dense trees. I wanted to explore it a little, but I was worried about my car getting stuck, so I decided to go on foot. I'm not sure what I was expecting to find, but being that there was daylight out, I really wasn't scared at all. I turned off my engine. As soon as I stepped out of the car though, I got a bad feeling. I stood there at the edge of the path, trying to see further down, but there wasn't much to see really. I don't know what it was, but something about standing there and actually being out in the open discouraged me from walking in. Things went from 0 to 100 in about 2 seconds. As I was turning around and walking back to my car, I heard a scream ring out behind me. It was this awful scream, definitely a woman's, and it came from somewhere deep in the woods, down the path. I can't tell you how fast I was out of there. Before I could even think, I was already speeding away. I don't think I've ever been so scared before, and that was about 2 weeks ago. I haven't been back to that spot since, but here's the thing, I can't stop thinking about it. Part of me knows I should just leave it alone, but I've been thinking about asking one of my friends to come out there with me. If I do, I'll record a video and send it, but for now, All I can really do is wonder about that scream and those people. This happened a few winters ago, when I was working overnight security for a commercial warehouse complex. I was 26 and had been doing the job for 8 months. The shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I was always the only employee on the site. There was a supervisor I could call if something went wrong, but for the most part, it was just me and the cameras. The complex was in an industrial area, on the edge of a small city that didn't have much nightlife. Most nights, I followed the same routine. Clock in, do a walkthrough of the exterior, then settle into the security office to monitor the cameras, and every hour, another patrol. The warehouse stored mostly industrial equipment and bulk supplies. Nothing particularly valuable. The night everything went sideways started pretty normally. It was cold enough for there to be snow falling, but nothing too heavy. I did my first patrol. Everything was secure, and I went back to the office around 1:30 a.m. I got a motion alert on one of the loading dock cameras. This wasn't unusual. The system was sensitive, and wind or animals could trigger it. I pulled up the feed and watched for a minute, but everything looked normal. Just the empty dock and snow drifting past the floodlights. But the alerts kept coming every 10 or 15 minutes. The same camera would trigger each time I'd check the feed, and each time I'd see nothing. What started to bother me was that the movement always seemed to happen just at the edge of the frame, like something was there but not quite in view. By 2:30, I had maybe 6 or 7 alerts from the same camera. No other cameras were triggering, just that one. At 3 a.m., I went outside to check it myself. The snow had mostly stopped, and the complex was dead silent. I walked to the full perimeter of the dock area with my flashlight. I didn't see anything unusual. All the bay doors were closed and locked, and there were no footprints in the snow except for mine. I went back inside. About 20 minutes later, I heard a loud metallic scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. It came from inside the warehouse, somewhere deep in the building. I checked the interior cameras, but all 6 feet showed empty aisles. I was starting to freak out a little bit because I started feeling like I was being toyed with or watched somehow. But still, I explained the noise away by chalking it up to the wind or something. An hour later, though I heard it again, it was louder. This time, the dragging sound was followed by a sharp bang, like something had struck one of the interior doors. I cycled through the cameras again, nothing on 1 through 5. When I got to camera 6, though, the feed was black, maybe 3 seconds of static, and then it came back, but something was different. The angle had shifted just a few degrees to the left, like someone had bumped the camera or adjusted its position. At that point, I had no choice. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed into the warehouse. The interior was massive, probably 80,000 square feet of industrial shelving arranged in long aisles. During the day, it was bright and full of forklifts. At night, the overhead lights were dimmed to save power, casting everything in this yellowish half-light. I was maybe halfway down the main aisle when I heard footsteps coming from somewhere to my left. It definitely sounded like someone, a person walking maybe 2 or 3 aisles over. As soon as I stopped, the footsteps stopped. I stood there trying to control my breathing. I remember how tense it was, standing there in complete silence, waiting for a sound that I wasn't even sure would come. After what felt like forever, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to break the silence. In a firm voice, I announced my presence as security and insisted that whoever was there make things easy and reveal themselves. But of course, there was no response. The rest of that patrol was utterly terrifying. I was bracing myself for a fight or some kind of confrontation, and the longer I surveyed without finding anyone, the worse that feeling got. But I ultimately finished my patrol without seeing another person, which was arguably worse, because I knew with 100% certainty that there was someone in there. I didn't see or hear anything for the rest of my shift, but that didn't make me feel any better. I actually felt somewhat guilty. My job was laughably simple, and I was messing it up in real time. But by the time 7 a.m. rolled around, I wanted nothing more than to just get out of there. I reported everything to my supervisor when he showed up on site. Maintenance did a full inspection, but they didn't find anything either. Even after everything was double and triple checked, no one was able to identify the method of entry, and I could tell people didn't believe my story. Still, though, that night remains one of the freakiest things that has ever happened to me. This memory still terrifies me, and outside of police and some close family, this is my first time fully revisiting it. A few years ago, I had gotten my first job at a 24-hour gym. At the time, I was in a gap year between high school and college, so I worked a lot of night shifts. The gym was open 24/7 and accessed by keycard only, meaning often there were only 1 or 2 employees working. People could just check in, use the equipment, and leave. The whole facility pretty much managed itself. All entries, exits, and usage of equipment were processed digitally, so all I had to do was sit in the office and keep an eye on the cameras. I would occasionally get up and walk around, do some light cleaning, and even talk to some of the guests. This was in a pretty bad part of town, but for the most part, everyone was nice and friendly. And it was one of those gyms where everyone kind of knows each other, considering how few people really come in. This one night in particular, I was working from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m., which is generally a very long, boring shift. But everything that happened that night keeps me up at night. It was around 2 a.m. when I had already done multiple rounds around the building and finished all routine paperwork. I was exhausted, so I just figured I'd sit down for a bit and monitor the cameras. Everything was normal at first. Not many people come in to work out in the middle of the night, but there were a couple of regulars who came and went. I had worked here for a few months now, so almost everyone I recognized except one man. I first noticed him when I saw him using a treadmill in the far corner. Normally, this wouldn't catch my attention as we have new guests from time to time. However, what really caught me off guard was how fast this man was running. I pulled up his treadmill number in the system, where I'm able to live monitor all equipment activity. He was running 9 miles per hour, which was impressive already. But what really shocked me was the fact that he never stopped. 10 minutes went by, then 15. He never slowed or stopped. I looked closer at the camera, and although I can't quite describe it in detail, this man was nothing short of unsettling. He was wearing ragged clothes. He had long, messy hair, and his face never moved. Once he was just staring straight forward. Then I noticed his feet. He was barefoot. He had been running 9 miles per hour for 15 minutes barefoot, just staring into the distance. At this point in time, I was very weirded out, especially since he was now the only person in the building besides myself. I pulled myself together and realized that we do have a policy requiring shoes, so I decided I would use that as an excuse to go talk to him. Although his appearance really freaked me out, I got up the courage to leave the office and head out to talk to him. The machine he was on was located almost directly outside the employee hallway, and as soon as I turned that corner, my heart stopped. The treadmill was covered in blood. His feet were tearing apart. As he ran, my heart dropped. Blood, not only dripping, but splattering from his feet and ankles for every step he took. His face was still stone cold, staring straight ahead. His mouth was wide open. As he ran, he looked like he was on every drug on the planet. At this point, I was terrified. He looked crazy enough to the point that my gut was telling me he was dangerous. However, I still mustered up the courage to yell at him to stop. I can't even remember exactly what I said, but I did have to raise my voice a bit so he would hear me over the thudding of his feet as he sprinted. He didn't say a word, or even turn his head, for that matter. He just continued to sprint and stare forward with his mouth open. I yelled again, something along the lines of, "Hello, what are you doing?" He then muttered the words, "Are you there?" in the coldest, rasping voice I've ever heard. He wasn't out of breath or even panting as he spoke. I told him to stop a few more times, and he repeatedly just said, "Are you there?" The pool of blood at the end of the conveyor was growing, and at this point, I just figured I'd call the cops. I went back to the office, picked up my phone, but before I called, I glanced at the monitors again. He was staring directly at the camera, sprinting, bleeding, mouth open, staring at the camera. I turned away and then heard him screaming from outside the door. He wasn't even screaming words, just screaming at the top of his lungs as he stared at me through the camera. Suddenly, he hopped off the treadmill. He didn't even turn it off, and he sprinted out of view of the camera. I immediately started clicking through the feed, searching for him, but he was out of view of every camera we had in the building. I had checked every camera except one, the employee hallway. Sure enough, there he was, about 6 feet from the office door, just standing there. I don't even know how he had gotten into this hallway without a key card, but I didn't hesitate to quickly lock the door. Almost 5 seconds after I locked it, the doorknob rattled. Now, I was calling the cops. He started screaming again and shaking the door as I explained to dispatch what was happening. They told me police were 5 minutes out, as I just waited in the corner of the office while this man was trying to get inside. His scream was terrifying. It was so deep, it barely sounded human, and he kept it up for an unbelievably long time. This went on for about 3 minutes. I thought if he got in here, I was gonna die, and I felt absolutely helpless. Suddenly, though, the screaming stopped, and the door didn't move. I checked the cameras again, and he was gone. I couldn't see him anywhere. Eventually, the police arrived, and I made them search the entire place before I would even leave the office. They told me he was nowhere to be found. I answered their questions and drove home. I quit the next day and have not entered that gym since. I have no idea what that man wanted or what kind of crazy he was. I still wonder what would have happened if I didn't lock that door. I moved to South Dakota about 5 years ago. It was the first time I'd ever lived alone, and honestly, it was long overdue. My parents had been on my case for years about getting out of the house, and I finally caved. I'm not exactly a social butterfly, so the idea of living somewhere secluded actually appealed to me. The house I found was in one of the snowier parts of the state, tucked away on a stretch of land where the nearest neighbor was a solid walk away. That was fine by me for the most part. That's exactly what I got. The first few years were uneventful in the best way possible. I kept to myself, went to work, came home, and didn't bother anyone. I never introduced myself to any of the neighbors. Partly because I'm just not that kind of person, and partly because there wasn't much of a compelling reason to do so. The houses out there are so spread apart that you could go weeks without seeing another soul. Everything changed one afternoon in early February. I was at work when the snow started coming down. At first, it was nothing unusual, but within an hour, it had escalated into something else entirely. The wind picked up, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the roads started getting dangerous. My boss eventually told everyone to head home before conditions got any worse. I drive a lifted truck, so I wasn't too worried about making it back. I have driven through plenty of bad weather before, and the truck has always handled it well. Still, there were certain sections of the drive that had me a little concerned. By the time I finally pulled into my driveway, I was just relieved to be home. But when I went to unlock my front door, I realized it was frozen solid. I stood there for a second, processing what was happening, then tried it again, but it wouldn't budge. I didn't have a lighter on me or anything else that could generate enough heat to thaw the mechanism. I tried breathing on it, cupping my hands around it, even banging on it a few times out of frustration. None of it worked. I walked back to my truck and sat there not sure what to do. The heater was blasting, and I told myself I'd just wait out the storm. Maybe it would die down in an hour or two and I could figure something out. But as I sat there watching through the windshield, the snow only seemed to fall harder. After maybe 10 minutes, I realized I was making a mistake. The longer I waited, the worse things were going to get. My truck was already half buried, and even with the lift, I doubted I'd be able to get back out of the driveway. So now driving wasn't even an option anymore. I didn't have anyone to call. I didn't know any of my neighbors, and my parents were hours away. I tried to drive the truck out of there, but like I suspected, it was stuck. My only real option was to walk to one of the neighboring houses and ask for help. I hated the idea of it showing up at some stranger's door, asking them to take me in, but I didn't have another choice. Staying in my truck all night wasn't going to work. The gas would eventually run out, and then I'd be sitting in a freezing metal box in the middle of a blizzard. The closest house was still pretty far away, probably a quarter mile or so. By the time I reached it, I was shivering uncontrollably. It was a tiny one-story house, and even through the blowing snow, I could tell it was in rough shape. I knocked on the front door as loud as I could. I waited for a good minute. I was just about to turn away and try the next house, when the door swung open so violently, I actually took a step back. The man standing there looked around 50 years old, with a very nondescript. He looked at me for a second without saying anything, then introduced himself as Joe. I explained my situation, and he nodded slowly, stepping aside to let me in. I should have felt relieved, but something about him felt off from the start. It was hard to pinpoint at first. The house was warm, which was all I really cared about in the moment. He offered me a seat on the couch and sat across from me at a worn-out armchair. We made small talk for a few minutes, or at least I tried to. He answered my questions, but his attention seemed to be somewhere else entirely. His eyes kept darting around the room from me, to the floor, to the ceiling, to somewhere over his shoulder. It was like he couldn't focus on any one thing for more than a few seconds. At first, I thought maybe he was just nervous about having a stranger in his house. That would have been understandable. But the longer we sat there, the more unsettled I became. He couldn't focus on the conversation either. He'd be mid-sentence, and then just trail off, staring at a spot on the wall like he was looking through it. I decided I wanted as little interaction with this guy as possible. I told him I was exhausted and asked if I could just get some sleep. He seemed almost relieved by the suggestion and pointed to the couch, saying I could crash there for the night. I asked if we could turn out the light, and he flicked off the lamp without argument, but he didn't leave. He just stood there in the doorway for what felt like a full minute, not saying anything, not even moving. I lay on the couch, with my eyes half closed, trying to look like I was already drifting off. Eventually, after this long, uncomfortable pause, he finally receded down the hallway, toward what I assumed was his bedroom. I really did try to sleep. I was exhausted, and the couch was actually more comfortable than I expected, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I started to drift off, and then jolted awake, convinced I heard something. About an hour in, I actually did start hearing things. It took me a few seconds to realize that the thumping and scraping sounds were coming from above me. At first, I told myself it was just snow shifting on the roof. That happens all the time in heavy storms, but these sounds were different somehow. That didn't make any sense though. The house was one story. There was no upstairs floor for anyone to be walking around on. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The sounds continued for several minutes, sporadic, but persistent, and then without warning, there was a thump that was considerably louder than all the previous ones. It was so sudden and so forceful that I shot upright on the couch, and as soon as I sat up, I saw him. Joe was standing in the doorway again. He must have been there for a while, just watching me in the dark because I hadn't heard him come back. My skin started feeling itchy. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could get a word out, he literally charged at me. He jumped over the back of the couch and tackled me to the floor. The next few seconds were pure chaos. We rolled around on the carpet, and I realized he was trying to put me in a chokehold. He was stronger than he looked, and for a moment I thought I wasn't going to be able to get him off. I kept resisting, and he started yelling. He screamed at me to stop fighting. He kept referencing this her like I was supposed to know what he was talking about. He said she was lonely, and something about how she would find me. Good company. I wasn't thinking about that though. I was fighting for my life. I finally managed to get enough leverage to shove him off me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my coat, and ran for the front door. I didn't even put my coat on. I was too terrified to waste any more time behind me. I heard that crazy fuck scream something. I'm pretty sure he said she's not gonna be happy, or some insane shit along those lines. I ran and didn't stop until I reached the next house. The family who answered the door were normal people, a husband and wife. From the looks of it, they took one look at me and pulled me inside without asking questions. I slept on their couch that night. The next morning I woke up to the wife who introduced herself as Kathy. She was making everyone coffee. The three of us sat at the kitchen table, and I told them what happened. As soon as I described the house, the husband, whose name was Brandon, interrupted me. He asked if it was Joe. I said yes, and he just nodded like he wasn't surprised at all. He told me that Joe had been a problem in the area for years, but then he told me something that gave my skin that itchy feeling again. About a decade earlier, Joe's wife had disappeared. There was never any official investigation. Nothing was ever proven, but most people in the area suspected he killed her. The body was never found. I immediately connected the dots, but kept my mouth shut for whatever reason. I still have no idea why I didn't speak up. I did end up reporting my experience to the police, but I don't think they ever did anything to deal with it. The scariest part is that I still live in the same house 3 years later. Nothing has happened since that night in the blizzard, but I'd be lying if I said I don't get a weird feeling every time I drive past Joe's house. The one silver lining to all of this is that I got close with the family who took me in that night, but I always get a weird feeling every time I go over there, because it reminds me of Joe and whatever god-awful thing he's done to his wife. This happened last winter, during one of the worst blizzards I can remember. I'm 27 and live alone in a small rental house in upstate New York. I work remotely in finance, which sounds fancier than it is mostly. I just sit at my desk and stare at spreadsheets all day. The point is, I rarely have a reason to leave the house during the week. Some weeks I don't leave at all anyway. The local news has been hyping up this blizzard for days. You know how they get. Every storm is potentially historic or life-threatening until it dumps 3 inches and everyone moves on. But this one actually looks serious. The weather alerts were telling people to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary. Stock up on essentials, all that. So I went grocery shopping that morning, grabbing enough food to last me through the weekend. And then I settled in for what I assumed would be a boring few days of working from home. The snow started in the mid-afternoon, and by around 8 p.m., I could barely see past my front porch. I spend most of the evening on my couch, half watching TV, and half listening to the wind howl outside. It's a specific kind of sound wind during a blizzard, not like a summer storm where it comes and goes. This was constant, like the house was inside a tunnel. At around 10:30, I heard a new sound. It was kind of like a loud thud followed by this dragging sound, sort of like something heavy being pulled across wood. I figured a tree branch had come down. There are a few old oaks near my driveway, and with all that snow and wind, it wouldn't be surprising if one of them dropped a limb. About 15 minutes later, though, I heard a car horn. It wasn't a normal honk. It was weak and intermittent, almost like someone had tapped the horn on accident. I went to my front window and looked out. There was a vehicle stopped near the end of my driveway. I could see its headlights cutting through the snow, but that was about it. I stood there for a few minutes waiting to see if anyone could get out, but I couldn't make out any movement with the storm the way it was. I couldn't even tell what kind of car it was. My first thought was that someone had slid off the road. It happens out there, especially in weather like that. It sounds callous, but I wasn't about to trudge out into a blizzard to check on a stranger, not when I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I went back to the couch and tried to focus on something else. At round 11, I heard knocking at my front door. I didn't open the door. Instead, I walked over and called out asking who was there. A man's voice answered. He said his car was stuck and he needed to come inside to warm up and use a phone. His voice sounded strained, like he was out of breath. Part of me felt guilty if this guy really had been walking through that storm. He probably was freezing, but another part of me still wasn't fully ready to just open my door to a stranger in the middle of the night. Instead of opening the door fully, I cracked it, making sure to keep the security chain locked. The man on my porch was covered in snow, like to a laughable extent. It was caked on his jacket, his shoulders, his hair. He was shorter than me, and he was visibly shivering. He said his phone had died, and that he'd been walking for some time trying to find a house with lights on. I was just about to open the door when I noticed his boots. I don't know what made me look down, but I did. And here's the thing, his boots were clean, like clean and dry too. If this guy had really been walking through a blizzard for any length of time, his boots should have been caked with snow and ice as well. Hell, I get like that. Just walking to my car, I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. I told him again that I would call for help and make sure someone came for him. He asked me to be let in again, more firmly. This time, I didn't respond. I just closed the door and locked it. I could hear him say something on the other side, but I was already walking to get my phone. I called 911 and explained the situation. While I was on the line with the operator, I heard footsteps move from my porch to the side of my house, toward the back. The operator told me to stay inside and keep all the doors locked. She said police were being dispatched, but warned me that response times might be delayed because of the weather. I moved to a side window and peeked out, not wanting him to see me. The man was standing near the corner of my house, maybe 15 feet away. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, looking up at the windows. A few minutes later, I heard banging on my back door, like someone was trying to break through. The whole door was shaking in its frame. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and retreated to my bedroom. I locked the door behind me and stood a few feet from the door. The banging stopped after maybe a minute. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like hours, but it was probably closer to 20 minutes. At some point, I heard the car horn again, the same one from earlier, but this time it was one long, continuous honk. Luckily, the police arrived shortly after that. They found a vehicle partially buried in a snowbank, but it was further down the road than where I'd seen the headlights. The engine was cold when they checked it, not warm like it would have been if someone had recently been driving it. Here's the part that still gets me. The officers told me there were no footprints leading from the vehicle to my house. Apparently the snow was undisturbed between the car and my property. There were footsteps leading down my driveway and around my house, but they stopped at the driveway like someone had been driving a separate car. The police searched the area, but didn't find anyone. The next morning after the storm had passed and the sun was out, I went outside to look around. To my horror, there were muddy handprints on the exterior of my bedroom window, which definitely hadn't been there. When the police searched the property, it was like the person had come back after they had left, or had been hiding and never left in the first place. A few days later, I found out that another house about half a mile away had been broken into during the storm. I know the whole incident doesn't sound that scary, but I can't help but feel like whoever was trying to get into my house, probably the same person that broke into the other house, was there to do something sinister. I'm just glad I didn't open my door. This happened several years ago now. I have told maybe 3 people about it. My wife, my brother, and one close friend who I knew wouldn't think I was losing my mind. I'm telling it here because I still don't have an explanation, and at this point, I've accepted that I probably never will. I am 34, and I live in British Columbia for most of my 20s. I was a professional skier, alpine racing mostly. I competed nationally for about 6 years before my body started telling me it was time to stop. Nothing dramatic like a career-ending injury or anything. Just the accumulation of wear and tear that happens when you've been throwing yourself down mountains since you were a kid. I stepped away from competition when I was 26, which felt like the right call at the time, and still does. But retiring from competitive skiing doesn't mean you stop skiing. If anything, it freed me up to do the kind of skiing I actually loved. Backcountry stuff away from the resorts and crowds. I say all this, not to brag, but to establish that I knew what I was doing out there. I was avalanche trained, certified in wilderness first aid, and familiar with every protocol you're supposed to follow when you're skiing alone in remote terrain. I'd done dozens of solo trips in the backcountry without incident. The plan that day was simple. I was going to hit a remote range a few hours north of where I lived. A spot I'd skied before, actually. The weather forecast was calling for light snowfall, maybe a few inches, but nothing that would prevent a day trip. I checked the avalanche conditions the night before, and again, that morning, everything looked manageable. I got to the mountain just after sunrise, strapped on my gear, and started skinning uphill. The snowfall started picking up while I was climbing, which wasn't unusual, but the wind had changed too. It was coming from a different direction than the forecast had predicted, and it was stronger than it should have been. Visibility was also dropping much faster than I was comfortable with. The smart move would have been to just turn around immediately, but I was already at the top of a line I'd been looking forward to all week. I told myself just one run, and then I'd call it early. I've replayed that decision 1,000 times since then. And before you say it, yes, I know it was stupid. I know experienced people die all the time in the backcountry because they make exactly the kind of call I made that day. I knew it then too, but I did it anyway. The descent started,